Imagine the heavy oak door of your convent cell creaking open in the dead of night. You're barely a woman, sworn to be a bride of Christ, but you've committed the ultimate sin. You've broken your vow of chastity. The figures who enter are not here for a simple prayer. They are here for a correction. What followed was not a swift punishment. It was a series of intimate humiliations whispered about in the darkest corners of the church, rituals that never made it into the official records. And it all builds to a final, horrifying fate so terrible the church tried to erase it from history, a secret punishment worse than any execution. Before we begin this journey into history's darkest intimate secrets, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. In the medieval imagination, the convent was meant to be a fortress of purity, a sanctuary where women devoted their lives to God, safe behind stone cloisters and vows of silence. They were called the brides of Christ, their souls promised to the divine, their bodies shielded from the sins of the mortal world. The rules were absolute, designed to forge a life of perfect devotion. The 6th century writings of Caesarius of Arles describe nuns as gems of the church, cloistered away to guard them from the spiritual wolves of the outside world. His rules, the Regula Virginum, laid out their lives in precise, suffocating detail. They were to rise before dawn for prayer, wear only the most modest dress, and avoid all vanity and idle chatter. Their meals were sparse, their voices were hushed, and their movements were confined. The enclosure was not just physical, it was a spiritual discipline, a lifelong vow to erase earthly desire. This ideal was so critical to the Church's power that by 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued the decree Periculoso. The language was stark and obsessive. It commanded all nuns to remain perpetually cloistered, to be protected from every occasion for lasciviousness, ensuring their nunnish modesty would be preserved forever. But this was not a simple act of protection. It was a desperate act of control. It was a sign that the Church knew that behind the stone walls, human desire was a powerful and dangerous force. The decree was a defense against temptation, against scandal, and against something that was already happening in the dark, because where control is harshest, resistance is never far behind. And when the sacred vows of the convent finally shattered, the Church's response was a terrifying display of institutional power, a series of punishments designed to purify the soul by systematically destroying the body. The whispers of sin were not just rumors. They were documented in the Church's own records, hidden within the quiet halls of some convents, forbidden acts unfolded in the dark. Take the case of the Wotton Priory in 12th century Yorkshire. Here, a tale of forbidden love played out like a tragedy. One young nun, according to the chronicler Aelred of Rievaulx, went out a virgin of Christ and soon returned an adulteress. She had taken a secret lover, likely a lay brother who worked within the priory grounds, and soon, the most undeniable evidence of her sin began to show. She was pregnant. Imagine the terror of that discovery. In a place built on the ideal of perfect purity, her body had become a vessel for the ultimate transgression. The scandal threatened to bring down the entire priory. Aelred records that what followed was a dramatic mix of punishment and escape, a story he frames as a miracle of forgiveness. But the details he omits speak volumes about the brutal reality she must have faced before any divine intervention. The story of Wotton Priory exposed the fragile line between sanctity and human desire, proving that no wall, no matter how thick, could truly extinguish the passions of the human heart. But if Wotton was a crack in the fortress of purity, Littlemore Priory in 16th century England was a total collapse. Here, sin was not a secret whispered in the dark. It was an open, festering wound of institutional hypocrisy. In 1517, church investigators, acting on rumors of disorder, arrived at Littlemore and uncovered a torrent of violations that shocked even them. The prioress herself, a woman named Catherine Wells, was the source of the rot. She had borne a child with the convent's own chaplain and had been stealing church funds to pay for the child's dowry. She was the ultimate hypocrite, indulging her own desires while brutally punishing the nuns under her charge for the slightest infraction. The official visitation transcripts, the Comperta, paint a horrifying picture of life under her rule. Nuns who disobeyed her were imprisoned in stocks, a painful and humiliating punishment usually reserved for common criminals. Other nuns openly rebelled. One even burned her way free from a locked room, and another confessed to the investigators in a desperate plea. "I am ashamed to be here under the evil rule of my lady." This was not a holy sanctuary. It was a private fiefdom of sexual license and cruel retribution. For the sin of the flesh, the church devised punishments of the flesh. These weren't just about causing pain. They were about psychological destruction and a perverse form of purification. The first of these punishments was a ritual of public humiliation, a way to strip a woman of her very identity, the shears of humiliation. In the medieval world, a woman's hair was more than just an ornament. It was a powerful symbol of her honor, her chastity, and even her social standing. Among Frankish royalty, for example, uncut hair was a mark of dynastic legitimacy. To shear a prince's locks was to strip him of his right to rule. For a woman, her hair, often intricately braided, was a public declaration of her virtue and modesty. When a woman chose to become a nun, the ceremonial cutting of her hair was a sacred act. The Merovingian chronicles tell of royal women entering religious life through this very ritual. In one case, a mother, renouncing worldly ambitions for her daughter, seized iron shears and shaped her child's hair into a crown, a gesture not of shame, but of holy dedication to God. The act was a renunciation of vanity, a willing sacrifice of a symbol of worldly beauty for a life of spiritual devotion. But when a nun's vow of chastity was broken, that same blade told a very different story. The sacred ritual was twisted into a punitive gesture designed to humiliate and dehumanize. Medieval legal records and ecclesiastical accounts reveal that forcible hair shearing was a common punishment for nuns accused of sexual misconduct or rebellion. Imagine the scene. The fallen nun, already judged and condemned, is dragged before her sisters. She is forced to her knees as her head is bowed in shame. Then, in a single deliberate motion, the cold iron blade scrapes across her scalp, stripping away not just her hair, but her status, her dignity, and her identity. This was not a holy tonsure, but a brutal desexualization. It was a violent act meant to strip her of the very femininity that was seen as the source of her sin. The act echoed secular punishments, where a married woman accused of adultery might be forced to appear in public with her hair disheveled or removed, a clear signal of her moral failure. Herein lies the terrifying paradox. The same act, the cutting of hair, could either sanctify or disgrace, depending entirely on who held the shears and why. For a devout novice, the tonsure was the double crown, a mark of her devotion to Christ. But for the transgressor, it was a brand of shame, a physical manifestation of her sin that she would have to wear for all to see. The hair that fell to the cold stone floor rarely grew back with the same meaning. This ritual was ultimately about control of the female body, of the female soul, and of how a woman's story would be told. Her virtue, once braided into her hair, was now replaced by a visible mark of dishonor. The public shaming was a brutal spectacle, but it was nothing compared to the horrors that awaited a nun in the silent, secret chambers below the chapel. For some, punishment was not a public affair, but a descent into darkness and silence. While public humiliation could break a woman's spirit, some sins were considered so grave, so threatening to the stability of the holy order, that they had to be dealt with in secret, far from the eyes of the world. This is where the terrifying legend of the convent dungeon was born. The historical record is often deliberately silent on this matter, but the fragments we have paint a chilling picture. Consider the terse, mysterious entry in the King's Justice Roll from 1304 at the Benedictine Priory of Clementhorpe in Yorkshire. It notes that a nun named Cecilia was reportedly taken by night. The culprits are unnamed, the reasons unstated. She was simply removed, vanished from her convent in the dead of night, with no crowd to witness her departure and no record of her captors. 2 years later, at another convent, a woman named Elizabeth de Hopton was seized under almost identical circumstances. These official entries suggest not a scandalous elopement, but a covert abduction. The question that hangs in the air, unanswered for centuries, is this: were these women being abducted by outsiders, or were they being dragged to a secret prison, within the convent walls by their own sisters, Modern historians rightly warn us not to confuse the mythical oubliette, a dungeon of no return, with the lived realities of convent discipline. Many convents had no such facilities at all. But the most powerful religious houses, especially those with wealthy patrons or powerful bishops, were a different story. These institutions may well have had private chambers used for what was called correction. What did this secret correction entail? We can only imagine the intimate questions asked to extract a confession, the psychological torment inflicted in soundproofed rooms where no one could hear the screams. These were places for silence, for penance, or simply for forgetting. The walls that were built to shield virtue could just as easily be used to conceal coercion. Centuries later, the myth of the convent dungeon would explode into the public imagination with the sensational 1836 book, Awful Disclosures, by a woman named Maria Monk. She claimed that within the walls of a Canadian convent, sinful nuns were held in secret underground chambers, where they were punished, silenced, and eventually erased. Her vivid, graphic tales of secret trials and torture gripped the public, stoking waves of anti-Catholic fear across North America. While Monk's book was widely discredited as fiction, its incredible success reveals something deeper, a lasting, profound suspicion that what happened behind cloistered doors could never be fully known. It tapped into the public's darkest fears about what men of the cloth and women in their service would do to those over whom they held absolute power. The idea of secret confinement in religious life captures the uneasy balance between piety and power. The convent dungeon, whether a physical reality of stone and chains or a psychological prison of silence and fear, represented the terrifying power of the church to make its problems and its problematic women simply disappear. But even this was not the fate worse than death we mentioned at the beginning. The ultimate punishment was reserved for the gravest sins, and it was a secret the church would try to bury forever. We now arrive at the climax of our descent, at the secret punishment teased in our introduction, a fate so horrifying it blurs the line between judicial execution and human sacrifice. For the most profound sins, for a breach of chastity that was seen as an unforgivable act of adultery against God Himself, the church reserved its darkest secret, immurement, the living tomb. This was not a common punishment. It was the ultimate sanction, spoken of only in whispers, reserved for those whose sins were thought to pose a mortal threat to the sanctity of the entire community. The practice involved walling up the condemned nun alive, entombing her within the very walls of the convent she had disgraced. Imagine the final moments. The guilty nun is led to a small, freshly constructed niche in a wall, often in a cellar, a crypt, or even behind the main altar. The space is barely large enough for her to stand. A single loaf of bread and a cup of water are placed inside with her, a perverse gesture of mercy that served a more cynical purpose. By providing sustenance, however meager, the church could claim it was not directly killing her. She was merely being left to her penance, to let God decide her fate. Then the sound that would haunt her final hours begins. The scrape of the mason's trowel, the wet slap of mortar on stone. One by one, the bricks are laid, sealing her off from the world. The single shaft of light from the outside world shrinks, from a doorway to a slit, to nothing. She is plunged into absolute darkness, absolute silence, save for the sound of her own frantic breathing and the frantic beating of her own heart. The air grows stale and thin. The water is gone in a day. The bread, a few days later. What follows is a slow, agonizing descent into madness, starvation, and dehydration. Her prayers turn to cries, her cries to screams, and finally, her screams to silence. And all the while, life in the convent above continues. The other nuns chant their daily psalms, their serene voices a horrifying counterpoint to the private agony happening just feet away, separated only by a wall of stone. While some modern historians have questioned the prevalence of this practice, evidence and legends persist. Archaeological discoveries have occasionally uncovered skeletons found in sealed niches within monastery and convent walls, their positions suggesting a death that was anything but peaceful. One of the most famous accounts comes from Sir Walter Scott's epic poem, Marmion, which describes the immurement of a nun named Constance de Beverley. While a work of fiction, Scott based his vivid descriptions on historical research and local legends surrounding the ruins of places like Coldingham Priory. He captured the essence of the punishment, a sentence that was both a physical death and a spiritual damnation, as the victim was denied a proper Christian burial. This punishment was the ultimate expression of control. The nun who had allowed her body to break its sacred vow was now having her body completely and utterly contained, her physical form imprisoned forever within the holy institution she had betrayed. It was a twisted, eternal marriage bed of stone, sealing her away from any possible future temptation. It was the complete and total annihilation of her as a physical, sexual being. The living tomb was more than just a punishment. It was a powerful statement. It transformed the sinner into a permanent, unseen part of the building itself, a hidden warning buried in the foundations for all time. It was the church's most terrifying secret, a fate worse than any quick execution by axe or sword, because it was a death that stretched over days in darkness and despair. The ultimate horror was not just the death itself, but the utter hopelessness of it, the absolute certainty that no one would ever hear your final pleas. The story of the fallen nun is a chilling reminder of a time when religious devotion and institutional cruelty were inextricably linked. The church promised these women a sanctuary, a holy life as the brides of Christ. But for those who strayed, that sanctuary became a prison, and the judgment was absolute. The punishments they faced, from the public humiliation of the shears to the secret terror of the dungeon, and finally, to the unspeakable horror of the living tomb, reveal a system born from a perverse and fearful obsession with controlling female sexuality. The veil, the stocks, the shears, and the hidden wall were all instruments of control, tools used to enforce a standard of purity that human nature itself often defied. These were not the actions of a few rogue abbesses or cruel priests. They were the products of a deeply ingrained ideology that viewed female desire as a dangerous, corrupting force that had to be policed, suppressed, and, if necessary, extinguished with extreme prejudice. The sanctity of the institution was deemed more important than the life of any individual woman within it. The silence of the historical record on many of these practices is, in itself, telling. The church, like any powerful institution, was adept at managing its image, at burying its darkest secrets in obscure legal texts and forgotten archives. The stories of women like Cecilia of Clementhorpe, who vanished in the night, are the exceptions that hint at a much larger, unspoken reality. As we look back from our modern world, it is easy to dismiss these events as the barbaric practices of a distant, unenlightened past. But the themes at the heart of this story, the fear of female autonomy, the use of shame as a weapon, and the brutal enforcement of ideological purity by a powerful institution, are timeless. The line between sanctity and suppression has always been a thin one, often written in stone and blood. The true horror of the fallen nun's fate lies not just in the cruelty she endured, but in recognizing that the systems that condemned her were built by ordinary people, convinced of their own righteousness, carrying out what they believed to be God's will. Was this brutal system driven by genuine piety, or by a dark, fearful obsession with controlling female desire? What do you think was really behind these horrific punishments? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.